honored to have as our guest today Dr. Gerard of the Virginia Tech University, and after he speaks, we will have Dr. Edyta Bojanowska from Rutgers University on Russian-Ukrainian literary relations, and then finally we'll have Dr. Casanova, of Georgetown, who will speak on religious plurality, I guess, in Ukraine. So this is a very much the on-the-ground resonance of the larger political discussion we had. I'm very much looking forward to it, and we'll have questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Gerard Toal, and what I want to talk to you about is how we understand the area of Russia and its particular neighborhood, particular geopolitical frames that we use in order to make sense of these particular spaces. Now, coming close to Christmas, I know making your particular Christmas list, so give a hint to your significant other that this is the book you want this Christmas, especially. Actually, this book is what I'm going to talk about. One argument in this book. It's going to be coming out in about a month or so. And this book is really about, I'm a political geographer, that's my background. And this book is about the ways in which we as a culture and Russia understand these particular places. And it is a complicated picture. And so we need to grasp that particular complexity. So let me just kind of bring it out for you a little bit. So you have places like Kaliningrad, which is separate. It's an exclave. It's separate from the rest of Russia, but it's part of Russia, right next to Poland, Lithuania. There's a lot of controversy right now because of the moving of nuclear weapons to that area. You have a place like Transnistria, de facto state, not recognized as a state by Russia or anyone else. But then you have South Ossetia, recognized as a de facto as a state by Russia and a few other countries. And you have South Ossetia also recognized by Russia and only a few other, about 5 other particular countries. And then you have this other territory, Nagorno-Karabakh, which is sort of, it's a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but Russia is also deeply involved there. Then you have a territory like Chechnya that is part of Russia, but has been kind of significantly important to the rise of Vladimir Putin, and to it's very important that we have Chechnya as part of the story of the emergence of Russian revanchism, which is a theme in the book. And then you have the territories in Ukraine, contested Ukraine. You have the annexed territory of Crimea, and then you have the 2 people's republics supported by Russia and so all of these are very diverse territories. So what I do in this book is I try to provide a model of these territories. Now, our dominant understanding of the relationship between Russia and its neighborhood is this an imperial power, and you have states that are seeking to overcome a legacy of empire. That is correct to a certain extent, but it's inadequate if we just leave it at that. There are actually 5 different spaces which are very distinct and different here, and I'm going to try to highlight for you. So you have the metropolitan state, which is the former imperial territory. You have the nationalizing state, which is the state, like Ukraine, that's seeking to create for itself an independent, separate identity. You have, within the nationalizing state, you have a particular territory where you have the concentration of a non-core ethnic group. And that non-core ethnic group means someone that is not part of the nationalizing state, may not feel that they're part of that project, even though the nationalizing state may want them to be part of that project. So let's say in the case of Georgia, Abkhaz and Ossetians were concentrated in these territories that were created during the Soviet Union. You have a different situation in Ukraine because the non-core group, especially in a place like Crimea, are Russian, and it has its own very particularities. Then you have the inner law within the metropolitan state. The metropolitan state is scared of dismemberment by certain groups, non-core groups within it. So that also plays in. And then you have on the horizon the external normative power, the EU, the United States. Now, I've just described to you the situation, you could argue, in Northern Ireland and Britain, where you have Ulster as the particular secessionist region, and you have this particular dynamic occurring. So what I want to say to you is what's occurring in Russia and its particular neighborhood has actually larger structural features which I think are important for us to grasp. Okay, how do we understand these territories? The dominant understanding in our geopolitical culture, it may change with dealmaker Trump as president. God knows what we're in for. It was going to be quite unpredictable. But the dominant understanding is that articulated by someone like Evelyn Farkas, who is former Assistant Secretary for Defense for Ukraine and Eurasia and Russia in the DoD. And she wrote an article in January of last year in which she provides a particular understanding, which is one that you'll find common, and most of you may have it. And that is that these particular territories are occupied territories. They're occupied by Russia. And so you have the argument that you have military occupations that have led to so-called frozen conflicts that serve as a Russian veto on the politics of those countries. Russia can influence those countries, but it should, but this is for argument, Russia can have influence in those countries, but it should be based on mutual sovereign agreement, not coercion. That's that's a sort of dominant understanding in our particular culture. And what I want to do is to complicate that. Now, in challenging the idea of occupied territories, I'm not making the argument that these are not occupied. So it's not a binary. Therefore, I'm saying they're, in challenging the idea of military, these as occupied territories, therefore they must be not occupied. No, I'm saying they're more than occupied. We need to think deeper about these places. And let's talk about what occupied territory means. Most of you in your training will have an understanding occupied territories is simply a territory where the government is by military power. So you have the Hague Convention of 1907, I presume, the kind of law of war is something that is taught here. So that's one particular understanding. Second understanding, and I think that's not prevalent because these territories are not ruled by the Russian military. The second one is that these are occupied territories because they've been invaded by Russia, and you have quisling governments established in these particular territories. And you have Russian troops on the borders, so-called borders, of these particular enclaves. So that's the second understanding. Now, it's also the understanding of the parent state. So here is a graph which was done by a very talented graduate student at the University of Dublin, and kindly agreed to give me this particular graph, which shows the ways in which the term occupied and annex really kind of spike after 2008, during after the 2008 war in Georgia. And that is the dominant understanding of the parent state is these are occupied territories. But notice that even before the 2008 war, there was an understanding that Russia was an occupying territory in Abkhazia and in South Ossetia, in Georgian understanding. There's a third understanding which is very important, and it relates to some of the things we were talking about this morning when we were talking about the Cold War and whether the Cold War is still being fought. and that is the understanding that these territories were under Soviet captivity. We, in our culture during the Cold War, we have a Captive Nations Week, and we still kind of, I think, we had a moral position about the ways in which the Baltic states were taken over, and we never recognized the annexation by the Soviet Union of the Baltic states. And that understanding is one that's still very important, and it's one that is kept alive by occupation museums in the Baltic states and also in Georgia, because Georgia established one. What that means is that from 1921 to 1991, certain Georgian nationalists, Mikhail Saakashvili was one of them because he helped establish this museum in 2006, believed that the Soviet Union itself was an occupation of Georgia, which means that the creation of an Abkhazia, the creation of a South Ossetia, and people who support that, in and of itself, that's part of the occupation. Now, I want to suggest to you this is quite pernicious because, in effect, that creates people who live on that territory as being fifth colonists who are part of occupation, a long-standing occupation. So that's something we have to think about. Okay. Then let me present to you some research. So I'm part of a group of researchers, political geographers, who have been very fortunate to get money from the US National Science Foundation to do research in the de facto states. And I just want to present to you a little bit of that data that we gathered through social scientific surveys in these regions. We've done multiple surveys in all of the 4 de facto states. We've also done research, a survey in Crimea, and I'll present those particular results to you. The Russian military presence is strongly supported in the occupied territories. So to say, effectively, when we say these are occupied territories, to the people who live there, they really support the military, the Russian military being there. They're extremely happy about it. So it's not like the normal understanding of occupied territories, where the military is sort of at odds with the civilian population. Perhaps something we will see in the areas in the West Bank and in Israel, and maybe in the US and Iraq. The second one, this is a particular survey which was conducted in December of 2014 in Crimea. Which view is closest to your opinion? So Crimea must have Russian troops. Now, Crimea has been militarized. That was part of the reason why Russia went and Putin went to annex it, as Richard Sackler mentioned in the previous session. So, but its identity is as a military place. But there's no kind of. We wanted to get some kind of sentiment as to whether people wanted or did not want a Russian military presence there. Overwhelmingly popular. Second point. The vast majority of residents of these occupied territories do not want to be part of their parent state. And here we have particular graphs which describe this. And that is, again, in some instances they want to join Russia. In other instances they want independence. It depends on the particular ethnicity that you ask. So in the ethnic Abkhaz in Abkhazia, really like an independent Abkhazia. Not so much the ethnic Russians that are living there, or the ethnic Armenians that are living there. The ethnic Georgians that still live there do want to be part of the parent state, but they're in an extremely difficult situation. They live in an area called the Gali district. So this is the attitudes. This is in southeast Ukraine and Crimea, towards Crimea joining Russia. And these are diagrams which are in the book. Thing to underscore here is that if you're ethnic Russian, and there's an ethnic Russian, but Ukrainian ethnic Russians in Crimea did support the annexation. Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians in Crimea did support the annexation in this particular survey. We can talk about the kind of the details of this. The Tatar community, was about 63 in the Tatar community. We cannot say that this is representative of the Tatar nation. They're like the Gali Georgians in an extremely difficult situation given the particular annexation of what occurred there. Okay, third point. The majority of residents tend to be positive about the Soviet Union, about Putin, and about Russia. So that idea of the Soviet Union being something which is an empire which is colonized, and therefore we, to be free of occupation, to be deoccupied is to get rid of the Soviet Union. That is something that is anathema to the population in these particular areas. The majority of residents in the occupied territories are positive about the direction of their state, or a particular statelet. So that is, again, also something to bear in mind. Now, we also need to remember that a number of people, especially in the case of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, there was ethnic cleansing that occurred. People were forcibly displaced from these. So the particular sentiment that you're getting there is a sentiment of a population that has been produced by conflict. I want to end with George Kennan and this particular book, which I hope you're still reading. I'm not a realist, but I am someone who is, I believe in a sort of worldly knowledge. And the part of having that worldly knowledge is to grasp the ways in which the world political map is very messy, the ways in which we are not well served by what I call sort of thin geopolitical understandings. And what I mean by that is morally dichotomized understandings like occupied territories, not occupied territories, free world versus non-free world, them having a sphere of influence or not having a sphere of influence. That's moral dichotomization. And I want to argue for a much thicker understanding which forces us before dilemmas which are morally complex and which we have to think about if we are to understand these particular places. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much to organizers for inviting me. I'm really grateful to be speaking to all of you today. I wanted to say that I respectfully disagree with most of what Professor Sakwa said in the previous session, but I'm here to speak about something else, about the Russian writer Nikolai Gogol, a 19th century Russo-Ukrainian writer, and I'm not sure how many of you have read anything by him, but hopefully after my presentation, some of you would be inspired to read him in case you haven't. In the splendid pageantry of the 2014 Sochi Olympics, the popular image of a luminescent Russian troika, a team of 3 horses at a slow-motion gallop, drew popular appeal. Your TV reporters didn't tell you, but it was the 19th century writer Nikolai Gogol who, in his novel Dead Souls, made this image into Russia's most revered national icon. Paradoxically, this author was born and raised in Ukraine, and as I argue in my book on this topic, it's not going forward. Oops. I'm having trouble. Oh, wait. Silly me. Okay, got it. Thank you. So, and as I argue in my book on this topic, though he was embraced in Russia as a national prophet, he had a pretty complex relationship to Russian nationalism. Why? 2 reasons. One, because his concurrent Ukrainian nationalist sympathies kept getting in the way. And 2, as Russian nationalism gained prominence, the Romanov Empire became less tolerant of ethnic and cultural diversity, more Russocentric. Probably no other person is as iconic for our panel theme of cultural dimensions of Russo-Ukrainian geopolitics as Nikolai Gogol. a Ukrainian who ascended to the status of a national Russian writer and who is being reclaimed in Ukraine today as a Ukrainian writer. No other cultural figure posed the contestable claims of both Russian and Ukrainian nationalisms and of their interdependence with as much complexity and lasting relevance as Gogol. So my goal today is to show how Gogol illuminates the topic of Russo-Ukrainian relations, both as they were in Gogol's own time and as they are in our own. Gogol is often touted as an imperial Russian success story. A Ukrainian youth of humble means arrives in the Russian capital of St. Petersburg at the age of 20. He succeeds in launching his literary career, earning recognition of major writers and critics. The Ukrainian subject matter of Gogol's first volumes of stories in no way diminishes the warm welcome with which the Russian audience greets this new talent from Ukraine. He is soon pronounced the head of the new nationally conscious realist movement in Russian literature. He moves more decisively into Russian themes after his masterful comedy, The Government Inspector, and writes what will become a foundational text in the history of Russian novel, Dead Souls. While the large brushstrokes of this picture are basically correct, I just realized I'm far away from the microphone. Gogol's entry into Russian culture was far from painless and easy. The Russian reading public struggled to reconcile itself with Gogol's Ukrainian identity and with the imperfections of his Russian nationalism. And Gogol, in turn, struggled to satisfy this public's taste for an uplifting image of Russia. So to the extent that Gogol is an imperial success story, he became one against considerable odds. Indeed, Gogol was initially considered a Ukrainian, not a Russian writer, and this is by Russian critics, despite his use of the Russian language in his breakout 2-volume collection of stories about Ukraine, Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka. So it was only later, when his literary talents were beyond dispute, that the Russian critics reclassified him from a Ukrainian to a Russian writer. So for them, the Ukrainian chrysalis turned into a Russian butterfly. In these early stories, however, Gogol pitched his Ukrainian nationalism so cleverly that it did not yet threaten Russian sensibilities. The Russian language of his works on Ukrainian themes, however, is so Ukrainianized as to be barely readable without a Ukrainian dictionary. Ironically, it was St. Petersburg that transformed Gogol into a self-conscious Ukrainian. He came to despise the city as the inorganic, soulless center of a dehumanizing bureaucratic machine, a place bereft of any imprint of nationality. His dislike for St. Petersburg bred nostalgia for Ukraine. While penning fictions on Ukrainian themes, Gogol delved into serious research on Ukrainian history, ethnography, and collected Ukrainian folk songs and antiquity. He even planned to move to Ukraine to become a professor of universal history at the Kiev University. The plan failed, and he was offered a position of Russian history in Moscow, but he rejected it, claiming that the subject was more boring than botany. At the same time, Gogol's literary work was bringing him ever greater critical acclaim, so he decided to become a writer. Since Russian literature offered an attractive path for an ambitious artist, he became a Russian writer. And since expressions of national specificity were a fashionable literary ingredient, Gogol began to fashion himself as a Russian nationalist. You may be tempted to call it selling out, but consider this. The Tsarist government persecuted the resistant Ukrainian identity with particular vigor, and we've heard that in a previous panel. Ukraine was the testing ground for the future policy of Russification. The history of Ukrainian lands and peoples became reduced to a tributary of Russian history. A Ukrainian nation was viewed as apostasy. The Ukrainian language, downgraded to a status of dialect despite a population of 10 million speakers, was banned from school. Publishing was prohibitively difficult. Tsar Alexander II later banned it from print altogether, and the ban was only reversed after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. After initial promotion of local languages, the language of social advancement in the Soviet Union soon became Russian. And today, the Russian Federation's intention to defend the rights of Russian speakers in the ex-Soviet states, such as Ukraine or the Baltics, is widely seen in these states as a tool in a larger and more cynical political game. In this context, it is little wonder that Ukrainians have tended to treat their language as an insurance policy on their political independence, misguided and flawed though it may be as a political project for today's Ukraine. But Gogol had no stomach for such fights, and realistically his ambition could only find outlet in Russian culture. His authorial traumas begin at this juncture. Russian readers perceived a troubling contrast between Gogol's works on Ukrainian and Russian themes. The Ukrainian ones featured good-natured humor, playful folkloric stylization, heroic historicity, and a loving affirmation of Ukraine's national wholeness. The Russian ones featured biting satire, a depressing analysis of contemporary problems, and cruel stabs at the Russian national ego. In responding to the satirical vistas of his comedy The Government Inspector and his novel Dead Souls, Gogol was widely accused of national slander, a malicious distortion of what Russia is truly like. One critic charged him with, and I quote, systematically demeaning the Russian people, unquote. Some now downgraded Gogol back to the status of a Ukrainian writer. Gogol's professions of love for Russia were seen as two-faced Ukrainian trickery. His vision of Russia was branded as the insidious work of a Ukrainian fifth column in Russian culture, and some privately expressed a wish to see the author marched in chains to Siberia. Gogol promised his readers a corrected, uplifting vision of Russia in the future volumes of his novelistic trilogy, of which Dead Souls he now claimed was merely volume 1. But he burned the manuscript of volume 2 a few days before his death, apparently unhappy with the outcome. After his death, critics used various ingenious arguments to explain away Gogol's uncomplimentary national vision of Russia, brushing aside its ironies. Gogol's other strategy to deal with readers' discontent was to Russify his own tale about the Ukrainian Cossack Taras Bulba, tempering the original's Ukrainian nationalist fervor. Trying to inject positive values into his image of Russianness, Gogol cross-dressed his epic Cossack hero Taras Bulba as a Russian nationalist. The Russified Taras Bulba, long regarded in Russia as canonical, became in 2009 the subject of the biggest budget post-Soviet film production by the same title. The film was a paean to the confluence of the supposedly fraternal Russian and Ukrainian nations. In the same year, Ukrainians put out a smaller TV production of the original Ukrainophile version, and in a sense, neither version was wrong, since Gogol himself set the precedent for the nationalistic re-engineering of his own narrative. So already in 2009, this cinematic duel highlighted the growing divide between a pro-Western Ukraine and Putin's Russia. So what can we say about the question of Gogol's identity? My analysis points to Russianness as a consciously adoptive aspect of his public persona rather than an innermost feeling. Gogol's civic commitment to Russia's future national greatness coincided with a sense of ethnic and cultural belonging to Ukraine. Much as he tried, Gogol could not make himself any more Russian than that. But Russians were becoming exasperated with the resilience of Gogol's Ukrainian interests and cultural identity. And Gogol read this message clearly in published polemics about his works and no doubt sensed it in personal contacts. Ukrainianness became for Gogol ever more an inner refuge. My analysis of Gogol's writings, correspondence, fragments, and discarded drafts yields a record of startling evasion, dissimulation, and disguise. A sly little Russian, Chytry Maloros, a Russian stereotype of Ukrainians, is a persona that Gogol in fact played to the hilt. Such slyness required a pretense of simple-minded naivete so as to lull the vigilance of those in power or evade punishment when caught. This was Gogol's chief mode of defense. Though well-intentioned, I simply knew no better. But what lies beneath this expedient mask? Here's one example. In Gogol's published historical fiction, like Taras Bulba, Cossacks pose for Russian nationalists, Poles are the treacherous enemy, and Ukraine is happily poised to join the imperial Russian fold. But Gogol privately experimented with ideas that invert this model. Have you heard of the Ukrainian hetman Mazepa. In the early 18th century, he tried to separate Ukraine from the Russian Empire. After his defeat, Mazepa was thoroughly vilified by Russian authorities. Until the revolution, he was publicly anathematized every year in all Orthodox churches. Yet Gogol, in his unpublished fragment about Mazepa, presents him favorably as a prudent statesman and patriot. He paints the Poles as Ukraine's friends and the Russians as a nation of slaves inured to tyranny by their autocrat. How far out is that? Now, discussions of Gogol's national identity unfailingly cite the following comments that he made to Alexandra Smirnova, his lifelong friend, who asked him point blank, "Are you Russian or Ukrainian?" 3 months later, Gogol answered, and I quote him, "I'll tell you that I myself don't know what soul I have, Ukrainian or Russian. I only know that I would not grant primacy either to a Ukrainian over a Russian soul, nor to a Russian over Ukrainian. But both natures are generously endowed by God, and as if on purpose, each of them in its own way includes in itself that which the other lacks, a clear sign that they were meant to complement each other. Moreover, the very stories of their past life are dissimilar, so that different strengths of their characters could develop and, having united, could become something more perfect in humanity." This is as harmonious an image of a hyphenated identity as can be. It gives no inkling of any dilemma on Gogol's part. It exudes balance and calm, as if he truly were at peace with his Ukrainian-Russian self. It celebrates a happy union of two national characters. Everyone quotes this glib statement. So let me tell you what doesn't get discussed. To truly understand this epistolary exchange, we must look to its genesis and context. The question Smirnova posed to Gogol arose at a gathering in aristocratic Russian society at which Gogol was accused of insufficient love for Russia and excessive devotion to Ukraine. And this is how Smirnova explained it, and I quote her. Count Tolstoy, by the way, not the famous Russian Tolstoy writer, a different Tolstoy. Count Tolstoy remarked that you portrayed all Russians in a negative light, just as you gave all your Ukrainians something that inspires sympathy, that even their funny sides have something naively pleasant about them. He said that none of your Ukrainians is as vile as Nozdrov, that Karopochka, these are all characters of Dead Souls, is not disgusting only because she's Ukrainian. He, Tolstoy, thinks that your lack of brotherly feeling involuntarily revealed itself when you said of two conversing mujiks, this means a peasant, two Russian mujiks. Tyutchev also observed that Muscovites would never say two Russian mujiks. They both said that your whole Ukrainian soul revealed itself in Taras Bulba, where with such love you presented Taras, Andriy, and Ostap. And to explain, Tyutchev's point was that only a foreigner would bother to mark mujik as Russian. Gogol's Russian public, through the question relayed to him by Smirnova, asked the writer to choose his one and only national allegiance. No combinations, please. So in this context, Gogol's eventual refusal to choose, I myself don't know what soul I have, actually shows the writer pushing back. Gogol's unwillingness to renounce his Ukrainianness shows the remarkable strength of this part of his identity and the value that he attached to it, not its weakness, as this has been interpreted. Gogol's initial reply to Smirnova, which doesn't get quoted, makes clear that the question irritated Gogol. You say, reach the depth of your soul and ask yourself, are you really a Russian or are you Ukrainian? But tell me, am I a saint? Can I really see all my loathsome faults? So in this initial reply, Gogol's binationalism, rather than doubling his advantages, seems to have doubled his faults. A hysterical tirade follows in which Gogol chastises Smirnova for failing to reform him, gripes about those who accuse him of two-facedness, complains of the insults, speculates about unnamed people who wish to do him harm. So far from calm and rational, this outburst reveals Gogol's anguish and deep-seated insecurity about his national identity. Far from a harmonious union, Gogol's Ukrainian-Russian identity emerges in this letter as an accursed affliction. And interestingly, the anguish stems less from Gogol's own inner dilemma, if he had one, but from his understanding that something else was expected of him. His Russian audience, both in print and in public, communicated clearly its discomfort with dual national commitments and demanded an unequivocal allegiance. So it took Gogol 2 months to collect himself and to produce the eventual balmy reply about a harmonious union of Ukrainianness and Russianness. But in the full context, this answer sounds as if he's fudging the question, rather than celebrating this hybrid Russo-Ukrainian soul. And his final, now widely known pronouncement was Gogol's carefully calibrated answer geared for the consumption of aristocratic Russian society. Its ideologically charged circumstances show that Gogol's admission to Russian culture had a price that he found dear. Let's see. So let's return to the image with which I began, Gogol's Troika. Here is the famous ending of the novel Dead Souls, from which this image comes. And just to clue you in, the protagonist is leaving town, driving fast in his carriage, and this prompts the author narrator to compare his carriage to Rus, which is, for Gogol's readers, this would be seen as a poetic name for old traditional Russia, but it's more complicated. Anyway, here we go, the ending of Dead Souls. And you, Rus, aren't you soaring like a spry troika that cannot be overtaken? The road is smoking beneath you, the bridges thunder, everything steps to the side and is left behind. An observer has stopped, struck by God's wonder. Is it lightning thrown down from heaven? What signifies this terror-inducing movement? And what unknown power resides in these horses, the likes of which are not known to the world? Having heard from above a familiar song, you tensed up your bronze chests instantly all together, and almost without touching the ground with your hooves, you transformed yourself into straight lines gliding in the air, and the Troika rushes onward, inspired by God. Rus, whither are you rushing? Answer. It gives no answer. The little carriage bell peals with a magical ring, the air cleft into pieces roars and turns into wind, and there all there is on earth flies past, and other nations and states, looking askance, step sideways and give it the right of way. In its soaring flight, the Troika transmogrifies into Russia itself, an icon of the nation's elemental energy and limitless potential, propelled by a divine mandate. This passage is familiar to all Russians from childhood, and most had to memorize it in school. So Gogol would almost certainly have been foremost in any Russian's mind at the sight of the Olympic Troika. So what the world perceived as a quaint cultural mascot had additional layers of meaning for the Russian public that were overlooked in Western media coverage of the Olympics. For Russians, the image would have resonated with Gogol's famous prophecy of Russia's primacy among all nations. What they likely saw in the Olympic Troika was a defiant symbol of newly assertive Russian nationalism. In the closing sentence of Dead Souls, all nations step aside, giving Russia Troika the right of way. So, but more than just rooting for the Russian national team, this was a sports event after all, the Troika bolstered the political significance of hosting the Olympics in Russia, an effort to solidify Russia's image as an ascendant political power reclaiming its rightful place on the world stage. Since the Olympics, Russia has moved to reclaim its place on that stage in a very different way, by annexing Crimea, sending masked operatives and massive military hardware into eastern Ukraine, building up a separatist movement there. The Olympic afterglow long extinguished, we may now think back to the fiery ring pulled by the mascot Troika, not as the sun, as we thought back in February 2014, but as something more ominous. I don't know, a ring of fire, perhaps? The Russian alphabet video released on the occasion of the Sochi Olympics proudly displayed the word empire as the example of the Cyrillic letter E with which the word's Russian equivalent begins. Imperia means empire in Russian. And this was a powerful statement, given that perfectly good, culturally specific alternatives did not make the cut, such as Ikona, which is an Orthodox religious icon. Since then, empire has come to signal not only Russia's historic pride, but a revived political project. It is not surprising that Ukraine is the arena in which President Putin's mission to gather the ex-Soviet lands, as many now fear is the case, would come into focus. Unfortunately for Ukrainians, Ukraine has always had a special place in the Russian national imperial imaginary. Tsarist ideology treated Ukraine's incorporation into the empire as a reunion with long-lost kin, the little Russian brother of the great Russians. Unlike Western European empires, the Russian and Soviet empires encouraged assimilation of their disparate peoples, particularly East Slavs, and assimilated people are easier to rule. A sizable part of Russian society does not fully accept that Ukrainians might view themselves as a separate people. The sending of tanks notwithstanding, President Putin refers to Ukrainians as a brotherly nation. Yet what to the West may sound like nice, friendly rhetoric resonates differently for Ukrainians. Kinship is an argument for imperial rule. Ukrainians have historic reasons to feel nervous. Cultural factors have played a key role in making Ukraine central to Russia's geopolitical self-image. Christianity entered East Slavic lands through Kiev. The Kievan medieval polity has been contested by both Russian and Ukrainian historians as the origin of their respective national histories, and Gogol incidentally took the Ukrainian side of this controversy. For many Russians to give up Ukraine would seem like severing historic roots and shortening their country's glorious history by 4 centuries. Such complexities did not assist, say, Britain's decolonization from India. Of course, this does not excuse the unwillingness of many Russians to mentally process Ukraine's right to sovereignty. And how come all countries make do with borders while Russia feels entitled to spheres of influence and buffer zones? The US has lived with the thorn of Cuba in its side for decades. Why can't Russia be expected to live with an independent Ukraine? It is unclear what right, under international law, maybe my co-panelists would know, the Russian Federation has to protect speakers in what it calls its near abroad, other than its own claim to it. It is Russian interference that has spurred the region's ethnic tensions to levels not seen in recent times. So President Putin is exacerbating the problems that he claims to be remedying. So let's turn to Gogol yet again for final reflection. Dead Souls is revered in Russia as a national epic. But what if we read it without the rose-tinted spectacles of Russian nationalism? As I argue in my book, the novel then emerges as a parody of a national epic. The celebrated Troika Russia is a profoundly ambiguous image. That carriage, carrying the protagonist, Chichikov, swiftly out of town. Guess who's sitting in it? A con man escaping tar and feathers. That soaring, ethereal Russia Troika. The source of this image is Chichikov's decrepit carriage drawn by 3 nags. One of the horses is described as possessed by demonic spirits. The list of repairs needed to make this carriage operational is so long that Chichikov's escape is delayed by a whole day. The direction of Russia's headlong surge is unknown. Has it neglected to ponder its destination? Could it be headed to a blind alley? Gogol's Russia remains an unstable enigma and a heedless, unpredictable force. The horses are at a full gallop, but where to? The narrator pleads, Russia, whither are you rushing? Answer. It gives no answer. As we witness the state, with the largest army in Europe, stoke virulent nationalism in the Russians both within and outside of its borders, these hooves remain suspended, and the question as urgent as ever. Thank you.
Good morning. Well, the PowerPoint presentation is being prepared. I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation. We are moving from literature to religion now. Religion and politics in Ukraine and Russia. It's a very long hour presentation, so I'm going to skip a lot of slides. the conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk has no religious dimension per se. Although the Moscow Patriarchate sometimes talks of it as a defense of Russian Mir, of Russian Orthodoxy, in fact, the people fighting on both sides, the majority of them, the soldiers, are members either of the Russian Orthodox Church in the Donetsk and Luhansk Republic or of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate in Donetsk and Luhansk. So if anything, it's a civil war in the Moscow Patriarchate, although the Moscow Patriarchate doesn't want to recognize it. The story I want to tell is that of basically two different trajectories of the two successor states to the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Both moved from being atheist secularist states proscribing religion or controlling religion to relatively secular states. But Russia has lately, at least already with 1997, with the passage of a new law, moved towards a fusion of church and state, while Ukraine maintains a model of secular state based on the two principles of no establishment of religion and no privileging any particular religion and free exercise of all religious communities. Now, Ukraine has become the unique case in Europe in which there is no national church and religious minorities, which are called sects, but actually equal denominations. In this respect, it's in itself interesting story. There you have the denominations. There are 4 churches in Ukraine claiming to be the heir of the Kievan Rus Church. The first is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, the second Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kiev Patriarchate, then the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, and then the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Those are the 4 so-called national churches. When you have 4 national churches claiming to be the national church, they are not national, and all the other religious minorities become equal denominations because you have a rather significant growth of Baptists and Pentecostals along with Lutheran Protestants, and significant also presence of Jewish and Muslim communities in Ukraine, in addition to other new religious groups. Let me just give you a sense of the tendency of religious revival in Ukraine. There's also religious revival in Russia, but I will basically compare both as having very different dimensions or directions. The direction is very clear. If we go back to 1990, right before independence, it would be even much lower the believers, much higher atheists and unbelievers. But I'm talking 2000, 2010 to see the direction of the growth, believers, unbelievers, not sure atheists. In terms of denominational composition, roughly 68% of the population claim to be Orthodox. Greek Catholics are roughly 76%. Just Christian meaning they are basically Orthodox, but they cannot define themselves as to members of any of the Orthodox churches. An additional 7%, 2% Protestant, 1% Roman Catholic, 1% Muslim, 1% other, which includes the Jewish communities and other new religions, and then 13% of unaffiliated. This is, oh, this didn't go good. Oh, well, it's a scramble. Basically, the idea is there has been a significant growth from 2000 to 2010 in the number of Moscow Patriarchate religious communities from 10% to 23%. The Kiev Patriarchate from 12 to 15. The Autocephalous Church has actually diminished. There is a small Ruthenian Orthodox Church. The numbers of just Christian, not yet defined, has diminished from 38 to 25. Those that don't know are already very few. Only today, 1.6% of the population doesn't know. And this has to do within the Orthodox. This is a very interesting data. Again, the numbers are not relevant per se. What is relevant is the trend. From 2001 to 2011, you have a consistent growth of all religious communities, Moscow Patriarchate, Kiev Patriarchate, Orthodox, Autocephalous, Greek Catholic, Roman Catholic, Baptist, Pentecostal, Seventh-day Adventist, Jehovah's Witness, Mormons, Jewish, Muslim, Hare Krishna, Ranvira, which are a pagan ethnic kind of local religion. All of them we have the growth of religious communities, consistent. Only the Mormons are the only ones that the number of communities went down from 57 to 54. Numbers of ministers, again, consistent growth across all of them. Numbers of Sunday schools, consistent growth across all of them. So you have a non-zero-sum game in which all religious communities in Ukraine are thriving and growing together at the same time. So this actually, within Europe, you have no such a story anywhere. In this respect, actually, Ukraine confirms the model of US denominationalism of a free religious market that helps all the religious communities grow. I will not accept the supply side theory of religious markets. Basically, the argument I'm going to do is that Ukraine has gone through a process of confessionalizations and reconfessionalization from above. Particularly, I'm going to focus on the 7 Western Oblasts, because this is a region that has gone through most changes, from being a stronghold of orthodoxy against the Uniate Church in the 16th century to becoming the home territory of the Greek Catholic Church under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then to be forced under Stalin to become everybody Orthodox Moscow Patriarchate. But then, after independence, there was the chance for the people to decide. And many of them went back to their own church, the Greek Catholic Church, but a lot of them moved to remain Orthodox, but within the 3 options of Orthodox. Now, what this shows is that these 7 Western Oblasts are the core of religion in Ukraine. It comprises 96% of all Greek religious communities. This is, of course, understandable. But also almost half of all the religious communities of the Kiev Patriarchate are within these 7 oblasts. Basically, 3/4 of the Autocephalous are within these 7 oblasts. Also, the Moscow Patriarchate itself has almost 1/4 of its communities are within these 7 oblasts. 30% of all Protestant religious communities are within these 7 oblasts, and almost half of all the Roman Catholic churches. Lviv, which is, of course, the center of Hagen, was the center also of Greek Catholic Church. Today remains probably the most pluralistic oblast of all of Ukraine. It has, it's true, the majority is Greek Catholic, but only 54%. It has 14% Kiev Patriarchate, 13% Autocephalous, 2% Moscow Patriarchate, 11% Protestants, 5% Roman Catholics, and then the others. Besides these Greek Catholic, Orthodox and Byzantine churches, Ukraine has been the center. The Bible Belt was the Bible Belt of the Soviet Union, had already very large Baptist communities in the 19th century, and today you have an explosion again of Baptist communities, became the kind of center after the Soviet Union of evangelical publishing, seminary training, and missionary recruiting for all of Eurasia. Interestingly, not only the Baptists, the Pentecostal communities have grown, and today the numbers of Baptists and Pentecostals in Ukraine are almost equal. Also, Ukraine has the largest mega church of Europe, an independent Pentecostal church in Kyiv, which has over 25,000 members. Let me move. Again, if you add the Jewish and Crimean Tatar communities, and then all these other, means that yes, the majority in Ukraine are Orthodox, culture remains Orthodox, but it is a very, very pluralist, religiously pluralist, would mean also a very pluralist civil society. The notion that Ukraine is becoming more monist in the religious field is the other way around. It's exploring in terms of pluralism, and religious pluralism is the most difficult form of pluralism. So if you have religious pluralism, it means other forms of cultural pluralism also. Let me just move. What happened with Maidan? Interesting enough, on January 22nd, Maidan began in November 2013. On January 22nd, at the moment when the parliament was going to pass laws criminalizing civil society organizations at Maidan and decriminalizing the use of force by the security forces. A representation of the Council of Religious Communities of Ukraine went to see Yanukovych to please not to use force against the demonstrators and offering themselves as mediators. What was interesting of this commission or this, that it represented, it has the kind of representatives of all the religious communities of Ukraine. The three Orthodox, the Greek Catholics, Roman Catholics, all the three Protestants, Lutheran, Baptist and Protestant, the Jewish and the Muslim communities, all of them went together to see Yanukovych representing basically the right of the people in Maidan to protest and that the state should not use force against them. Interesting enough, at the time, the Moscow Patriarchate was the head of the council because the head of the council is changed every 6 months. And because of that, the Moscow Patriarchate also had to go with the whole group representing the same demands to Yanukovych. Now what happened? The interesting thing that this concept of all the communities indicates the extent to which there is no inter-confessional, inter-religious conflict in Ukraine. Despite the often rantings of the Moscow Patriarchate against uniatists, against non-canonical Orthodox schismatics, against Protestant heretics, all of them were together at Maidan, both ordinary people and Orthodox priests, Greek Catholic priests, Roman Catholic priests, Protestant minister, Jewish chaplain, Muslim chaplain, all of them were presenting at Maidan. After the fall of the Yanukovych regime, all conflict and violence came to an end in Kyiv despite the Russian propaganda concerning the revolutionary takeover by violent fascists and anti-Semites. But the violence, indeed, open military aggression began in earnest now in Crimea and in the eastern oblast of Ukraine, particularly in Luhansk and Donetsk. What is interesting from the point of the religion is that in Crimea, which had also a relatively pluralist religious field, what you find is that the Crimean Tatars begin to be proscribed or at least regulated. The Roman Catholics have to leave. The Kyiv Patriarchate has to leave. Protestants have to leave. Greek Catholics have to leave. So now you only have one official church in Crimea, the Russian Orthodox Church. The same thing has happened in the republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. All the other religious groups basically are proscribed or persecuted. In the case of Crimea, all their ministers and religious leaders had to receive Russian passports, and either they were denied or they had to basically declare themselves as foreign agents, because this is the model of religious pluralism that has emerged in Russia. Let me move quickly to Russia. The Russian Federation, let's call it the Russian Federation, is the official name, to fact is not only Russia, huge territories which is part of the colonial expansion of Russia since the 16th century all the way to the Pacific, and basically it's a multi-religious state, very much so, but it has moved. The 1993 constitution was declaration of the Russian Federation as a secular state guaranteeing religious freedom. The 97 federal law, already on freedom of conscience and religious associations, contains the recognition of the special role of Orthodoxy in the history of Russia and in the origins and development of her spirituality and culture. And despite this constitutional self-definition as a secular state, the Russian state makes de facto clear distinction between three types of religion. The Russian Orthodox Church, which is the national church, which is the church of all ethnic Russians, but also the ethnic Slavs. This is the notion of the Rus Mir. Then you have the historical churches of the Russian Empire, Jewish, Buddhist, Muslims, and the historical Protestants, which are accepted as religions that have the right to exist and therefore free exercise. And then the third, all the new religions, non-traditional, non-historic, which basically are either hindered by cumbersome process of legalization and local permits, or are under close state regulation and surveillance, insofar as they are viewed as foreign agents and therefore as a threat to national security. This is the case of the Roman Catholics, new evangelical and Pentecostal sects, Mormons and Jehovahs, and other groups identified with the United States, as well as new dangerous cults or extremist Muslim groups, all fall under this category. Now, Russia has also gone, or the Russian Federation, through a very significant process of religious revival. But this has taken the form of confessionalization, in which people that were basically atheists, non-religious, because in this respect the secularism from above was almost as successful in Russia as in the East Germany. There has been an increasing reconfessionalization of the Russian population. Let me just move. I'm just going very quickly just to give you some of the numbers. Basically, this is again the clear trend. In 1991, only 31% of the Russian Federation declared themselves Orthodox. By 2001, it was 50%. By 2011, 69%. Very clearly a Russian confessionalization. Now, the non-religious have also decreased from 61%, 37% to 22%. So a very clear process of religious revival, but not pluralization. This is the model. You have Russian Orthodox 41%, other Orthodox 1.5%, just Christian 41%, then you have the Muslims, historical Tengish neo-pagans, basically in the Pacific regions, Buddhists, also other religions, you have small groups of all believers, Catholics, Protestant Jews. Still a significant number is spiritual, not religious, 25%, atheists, non-religious, 13%, undecided, 5.5%. So what you have is a very clear trend of re-identification of the population of the Russian Federation with Orthodoxy, with the Moscow Patriarchate as the national church. In terms of actual religious revival, the evidence is not very strong. In terms of religious practice, you see there basically has not been basic change. People that go to church once a week, 1% 91, 3% 96, 2%, 2%, 3%. So basically there has been no change in the actual religiosity of the population. Weekly, again, and monthly, basically has remained 4%. It is the occasionally, the high holidays, when people really, you have a growth of people going to church on Christmas and Easter from 18% to 40%. And those who never go to church have diminished, but still, almost half of the population in the Russian Federation never go to church. In Ukraine, the people that never go to church is maximum 10%. It is the same. Here you have the number of communities. Religious communities, 50% are basically Russian Orthodox. But look, 25%, 5,000 Protestant religious communities in Russia, 16% Muslim, 1% all believers, 1% Roman Catholics, 1% Buddhists, 3% others. But this is a very interesting comparison. In terms of religious communities, there are more Moscow Patriarchate religious communities in Ukraine, almost a third more, which in the Russian Federation. And so the whole communities, again, Ukraine has almost a third larger, more religious communities than all of the Russian Federation, and even more Orthodox than the Russian Federation. Protestants, also more Protestants than the entire Russian Federation. The population is less than a third. Roman Catholics much more. Only Muslims. Russia has clearly many more Muslim communities than Ukraine. The point is that Brzezinski used to say, without Ukraine, Russia cannot be an empire. Without Ukraine, the Russian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, is not the largest church in the world. It will remain, a lot of Ukrainians are members of the Russian Orthodox Church, and this is likely to remain. Don't forget, the president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, is a member of the Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. So the fact that you're a member of the Moscow Patriarchate doesn't tell you anything about your relationship to Russian nationalism. On the contrary, most of the Russian Orthodox and the Orthodox Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine are in this respect Ukrainian, let's say, patriots, or at least. Ukraine after Maidan was probably something unthinkable in any other country in Europe, in which the head of the state, the president, was Moscow Patriarchate, Orthodox. The prime minister was a Greek Catholic. The head of the parliament was a Baptist. It's No other European country could have such a representation, only either in the United States or in India, to other religious pluralist countries you could have. And let me just finish today. Professor Plochi began his lecture mentioning how recently a statue of Prince Volodymyr was basically established in Moscow. You may remember that when Putin finally recognized that yes, we annexed Crimea, because Crimea is and has always been Russia, because Prince Volodymyr was baptized in Crimea. If this is the reason why Crimea is Russia, of course, all of Ukraine and all of Belarus is also Russia.
I think we should have a few questions and then your comments, or
Yeah, sounds good.
are there any questions for our panelists?
Dr. Casanova, where is your book?
Please.
What book do you have?
The cells.
Have you written a book yet? Did everyone else have?
Not in Ukraine, I'm an expert in Ukraine. I write now on the Jesuits and globalization. I write on Asian Catholicism and Christian globalization. The book most famous, Public Religions in the Modern World, the comparison of Poland, Spain, Brazil, and the United States. I've written all kinds of other subjects. I have not written much on Ukraine or Russia.
Two questions. One's for Dr. Toal and the other one for Dr. Casanova. And they're similar. I wanted to have both of you address the changes that you saw in your research from the data. I think Dr. Toal, you were, in one of your tables, you had this data from 2010, 2011 to 2013, 2014. What do you think is explaining, that was the data for the different ethnic groups and how they felt attached to being in an occupied territory. I noticed that oftentimes there's been a decrease in how much they are committed to feeling that they're part of the Russian state. Is there some explanation why you see numbers slightly going down across all groups, including Russian groups and Armenian groups? Maybe you might want to pull that slide back up if that can be helpful. And that's my similar question to Dr. Casanova. You explained that Ukraine, particularly, is a very pluralistic religious society, and that it's growing, but I don't have an understanding as to what is driving the growth. Why are they so unique in being more religious than other European places? A little bit more context would be helpful.
Sure. Well, rather than picking up or pulling up the slide, it'd probably take too long. The changes, they're not that significant. As a macro statement, the change, it's more continuity than change that you see. But obviously, the big change is the annexation, the events of 2014. The survey was conducted, the last survey, with Dr. John O'Loughlin and Dr. Vladimir Koltsov at the Russian Academy of Sciences. That was conducted in 5 different places at the same time. So Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Southeast Ukraine, Southeast 6, SE6 is how we're determining it, except the areas where there was war going on, and also Crimea. And 75% of the questions were the same. And so, we're working on a book on that. But there's a publication which is coming out in a volume called Questioning Post-Soviet. It's coming out next month from the Kennan Institute, the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, and that is to mark the 25th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in that we have a piece. So those particular diagrams that you see, those were produced for that. And they're to look at specific changes. We have to talk about particular places, and I guess rather not drill down into certain details because it bore people probably.
It's a complex question. I don't think that I have the answer, but I will give you an indication of what the answer is. The whole question is what drives secularization, what drives religious revival? There is a theory in the United States called the supply side theory that when you deregulate state the regulation of religion, you have an open field, you bring supplies, religious growth. And America seems to fit this, Ukraine seems to fit this model. But the state deregulation in East Germany, the bringing of the Roman Catholic Church, the evangelical church didn't bring any religious growth. So state deregulation per se doesn't do it. So why in Ukraine? I would argue, again, my thesis is because the official thesis was the whole world is becoming more secular as it becomes modern. America was always the exception to the rule. Now the argument is, no, Europe is the exception to the rule, but then what explains secularization? And so my argument is what explains secularization in Europe is process of confessionalization from above, the church forced the whole Northern Europe to be homogeneous Protestant, Southern Europe homogeneous Catholic, two bi-confessional societies in between. I'm talking of continental Europe. And this model basically has remained. There has been no religious change in Europe, no with the change of sovereignty from the monarchy to the people, to the nation, no with expansion of the suffrage, with mass democracy, no religious change in Europe, other than one brought by new immigrants. Ukraine, this was the point, was confessionalized and reconfessionalized many times, has always been a very religious society compared to Russia, so this has always been there. Under the Soviet regime, the Western Oblast that finally were annexed were forced to become Moscow Patriarchate. When they had the choice to again be free religiously, they simply exercised this freedom in all kinds of different directions. So they didn't go back simply to Greek Catholic confessionalization, but they had all these options, and they are exercising these options. This is good as that. But here you have the expert, Professor Frank Sesson will probably.
I fear that Professor Casanova's account comes out a little more positive than I would make it on this issue of religion and that. So I'll just mention this and then. So in particular, since the Maidan, we have seen considerable shifts away from the Moscow Patriarchate in religious affiliation, what the population has asked. The Moscow Patriarchate, for a number of reasons, seems to have fallen much more into line with the Ruski Mir ideology in this hierarchy.
The hierarchy.
Yeah, the hierarchy. Not talking about the constituency. And there is an increasing cutoff between that hierarchy, beholden in some ways to Moscow, but also fearful of its situation. And with that, a politicization of it, to a certain degree. That is, it's putting its bets on Putin, right, which is their only salvation now. So what I felt, and maybe you can comment on it, is that the politicization of religion has occurred in various governments in Ukraine. They have preferred one or another church, but there's a resistance to society. But the present moment is going towards a real crisis for the particular Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine in its relations with constituency, as it becomes in many ways much more instrumentalized by both patriarchal and by maybe comment.
I mean, the situation is long-term is unsustainable. Obviously, President Poroshenko, however, is a member of the Moscow Patriarchate and doesn't have the need
yes, but
to
he goes to
move.
church to the Kiev Patriarchate on all major holidays.
Well, of course, because he's a good politician.
He's formally a member of the Moscow Patriarchate who is basically shifted
Right.
in where he goes.
What happens is we have evidence of people's expressing more positive Geopolitics than, but in terms of numbers of religious communities, parishes moving, there are a significant number, but not the one that would be
But
expected.
people have moved, not parishes.
Yes. And the next question is why they are not moving. Ultimately, it's a question of canonicity. As long as the Geopolitics is not accepted as a canonical church by the rest of Orthodox countries or by the Bartholomew, by the Ecumenical Patriarch, it's very difficult for a lot of people that belong to the Moscow Patriarchate to actually join the Geopolitics as long as Filaret is there. Filaret is a person who is basically, because of the long history of relations, has difficulties being accepted by a lot of Orthodox as their leader. So I assume that if there comes a new leader to the Geopatriarchate, and especially if Bartholomew was to accept the canonicity of the Geopatriarchate, then of course there will be probably a very large move away from the Moscow Patriarchate. If those things, but even then, I assume that Ukraine will remain divided into three major national churches: Moscow Patriarchate, Geopatriarchate linked to Constantinople, and the Greek Catholic Church linked to Rome. So Ukraine will be the place of the three Romes, and will remain so for a long, long time.
Good morning, thanks for being here. After the annexation of Crimea, Pew sent out a poll to European millennials to gauge the feeling they have towards Russia. Greek had the warmest receptions and had 65% favorable views of Russia, 45% Russia respects personal freedoms. Do you see the presence of Greek Catholicism as a key factor leading towards a warm Greek attitude towards Russia? If so, how would it if religion should tie Greece and the Ukrainian Greek Catholics together while the Ukrainians clash with Russia?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question. Greek Catholics here is necessarily has no relation with Greece. They are called Ukrainian Catholics. They remain, so the name were given under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Greece in general, the population has maintained a very, very favorable or positive relationship to the Moscow Patriarchate. I mean, here, this year was going to be the year of the synod of all the Orthodox churches. Moscow Patriarchate was expecting to be enthroned as the church representing all of Orthodoxy. The war in Ukraine has somehow put a problem into this process, and now we are not sure how such a synod of Orthodox churches could take place.
Thank you so much. Sorry we have to cut it short, but you guys are all restless for the big lunch coming up, I know. So let Professor von Hagen sort of tie the points together that we heard today, and we can continue the conversation after. So let's go around again.
Okay. You said that culture was the section we're going to do, kind of to add on to this, but actually culture, as you realize, is central to this war that's going on. And I want to try to bring it back to war. You've heard about religion, you've heard about Gogol and literature, you've heard about geography. I want to try to make some sense of all of this as best I can and hope that it might help you. So here's one of the problems. What's happening in Ukraine and Russia is called a humanitarian mission and a civil war. For Ukraine, although it's clearly a war of aggression, it can't be called officially a war because otherwise Ukraine will be denied aid from the IMF and European loaning if it's at war with a country. So it can't be a war even though it is at war. And this gets to a big problem. War is not war and peace is not peace. And that was, if you know your history of 1918, when the Bolsheviks were negotiating with the Germans, Trotsky walked out of the negotiations and said, no war, no peace. And that became sort of a statement of Bolshevik foreign policy. He was defeated, and eventually there was a sign of peace. But this is part of the problem, that what's going on today is about narratives and identities. And you heard about literature, you heard about religion, you heard about culture and history, and the monuments to Vladimir, about Crimea. And a colleague of mine at Arizona State University, Brad Allenby, who is an engineer and an Army veteran, has pointed to the Crimean narrative as sort of central to this kind of war that he is calling civilizational conflict. And I want to start with this definition of hybrid warfare, which is what NATO is currently calling what's going on there, among other things. And this is a statement from the chief of the Russian General Staff a year before the Ukrainian crisis. The focus of applied methods of conflict has altered in the direction of broad use of political, economic, informational, humanitarian, and other non-military measures in coordination with protest potential of the population. All this supplemented by military means of concealed character, including carrying out actions of information conflict, actions that this is getting from the Russian official chief of staff. Open use of forces is resorted to only at a certain stage, primarily for the achievement of final success in the conflict. The very rules of war have changed. The role of non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals has grown, and in many cases, they've exceeded the power of weapons in their effectiveness. So again, my colleague Brad Allenby calls this civilizational conflict. It's kind of a response to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization, but a critique of that at the same time. So what he's saying is that all dimensions of civilization are being mobilized in a long-term, intentional, coordinated conflict, one aspect of which may or may not be conventional combat. It has to do with belief systems, culture, psychology, beliefs, ideology, perceptions. And again, what the Russians are calling new generation warfare, the Chinese are calling unrestricted warfare, my colleague Brad Allenby calls civilizational conflict. And again, it's something that we as historians, we didn't sign up for a war with Putin, but I think Putin has made us that, and our mission is not to come up with a Ukrainian version of history to posit against the Russian one, but to deconstruct the Russian imperial myth. And you've heard about how Putin is claiming Crimea is Russian eternally because a saint was Christianized there, and how Gogol, a Ukrainian writer, becomes a symbol of the Sochi Olympics Russian power. And if you saw that opening ceremony, it's a frightening sort of red and black celebration of Russian power and industrial might and military power and imperial power. So I would like to also kind of come back to Professor Santos' concern about the rise of monism and the threats to pluralism. And you heard about how Ukraine is pluralist, very religiously pluralist, and I think that is matched to some degree by civil society pluralism. And it's Russia that is imposing a monism. And again, the longer the war lasts with Russia and Ukraine, the closer Ukrainians are going to become monist too, because Putin is closing down Russia. And I think one of the things that we need to do is keep all our ties with Russia and dialogue with Russia open to keep him from shutting down Russia from the world. And he's not the only one. I mean, the Polish current government, the Hungarian government also want to shut down their countries from gay Europa, from the European Union, from American policy, from NATO. And this is a war that is being fought in every country in some way or another. And again, I say Ukraine is perhaps the most dramatic battlefield of this war, but it's a war that's happening in Moldova, in Georgia, in Poland, in Romania, and in this country as well. So I leave you with kind of that attempt to put it all together. And all this culture is not just a sort of an incidental footnote, it's key to this new civilizational conflict, if you believe my colleague Brad Allenby. So I want to thank John, Tom Sanders and Catherine for inviting us all and for putting this wonderful panel together. And again, the fact that we disagree so much about what's happening in Ukraine is part of the impact of the war too. It's not that we've always been agree about everything in our field, but the last 2 years has shown, has brought out these disagreements that you've heard expressed here before you today in ways that we haven't seen probably since the Cold War. Whatever ending that was in 1991, whether it ended or not is another question. So I thank you again, and thank the hosts, and thank all of you, and I thank you for your service.